I'm Steve Goodwin. I'm the Dean of Natural Sciences here at the university, and it is a great pleasure to have all of you here with us today to celebrate the life and work of Lynn Margulis. So it's a real pleasure to be sharing the moderating duties this morning with Mark Leckie, who's the current head of the Geosciences Department, and I think he wants to say a few words of acknowledgement for some of the people who put the effort into making today actually happen.
Thank you, Steve, and I want to also extend my, my welcome to UMass. And Lynn was surrounded by some really wonderful people, and all those wonderful people have been working really, really hard the last several months to bring some closure to the lab and to move forward in science and their own lives. And I would just like to acknowledge all the hard work, the dedication, the incredible devotion and love that the Margulis lab had for Lynn. And that includes Celeste Asakainen, Mike Dolan, Jim McAllister, Sean Faulkner, Bruce Schofield, Kendra Clark, Mike Kelly, Robin Kolnicki, Cordelia Sand, and Militia Santiago. And I hope and Diane, I'm sorry, I hope I didn't leave too many other people out. I'm sorry, I just, anyway. This whole event would not have come off without the incredibly hard work of Celeste. Where is Celeste? Celeste was Lynn's lab manager for many, many years. Many of you in the audience know Celeste for this long time, but really has done a wonderful job in pulling this together, basically putting her own dissertation research, which she's been trying to finish up this year, has been on hold, but moving forward after this event. Now, I would like to remind everybody that there was such a groundswell of interest in participating in this event that we're actually extending this over to tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, right across the street in Morrill Science Center, we will have a continuation of this celebration. I hope you'll join us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the day, Peter Westbroek. It's no secret how important Lynn thought Peter's work was. She brought this home to me one day when she was sitting in my office, and I noticed she kept looking over at my bookshelf. Finally, she said to me, you know, you call yourself a geologist and a microbiologist. How come you haven't read Life is a Geological Force? And I looked at her and I said, Lynn, I've read it. And she goes, well, how come it's not on your bookshelf? I said, well, it's at home, Lynn. She says, that book is so important, you need to display it prominently on your bookshelf. So I brought it in, put it on my bookshelf, and even today, that book is still on my bookshelf. So, Peter, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
That book was filled out long ago. I'm very grateful to be here, and actually, to me, this is a very emotional day. Lynn, I never knew what it was. Either she was my sister or she was my mother, and it feels now if I'm left on my own. Adult at long last. But I won't be the only one here to feel that way. Lynn was extremely multifaceted, both as a scientist and as a person. And what I find so amazing about her is that to summarize all that activity, one doesn't even need a one-liner. One word is enough: symbiosis. Her entire life was an ongoing lesson in living together. But I feel that her work had implications, maybe she wasn't even well aware of it, I don't know, that were far beyond the limits of science and of her own work. So I puzzled about this for decades, and I now have come to a conclusion. I consider her, I hesitate to say it, as a herald of a new worldview. Shall we call it the symbiotic worldview? Now, to place things into perspective, we have to think the big stuff. Animism, geocentrism, heliocentrism, and modernistic worldview, and now then the symbiotic worldview. That would make Lynn as a kind of Copernicus of today. Now, a worldview is more than an intellectual exercise or a new scientific paradigm. And to really understand the significance of it, I want to remind you of this wonderful story by Edgar Allan Poe, Descent into the Maelstrom. You must read that if you haven't read it yet. It's about two fishermen just before the Norwegian coast, and they're catching their fish, and then they get caught up into a gigantic maelstrom. Nobody has ever seen anything as big as that, and it just turns round and round and round, and they're caught in it. And they know that their end is nearby, but mark the difference in reactions between these two people. One, the eldest, clinges to the boat, and he closes his eyes, and he doesn't want to know anything anymore, and he gives over to his fears. That's all there is to it. And the other one says, wow, I've never been in a place like this, or in a situation like this. What a pity that I can't tell that to my best friends, because I'll be dead in no time. And he looks around and sees all these things whirling around, old shipwrecks and bits and pieces of everything. And then he sees suddenly that the casks and things like that, they are intact, and they're not destroyed, because most of these things go down and they're just destroyed, but they just keep floating around high up. And then he looks and he says, I'm just on a cask like this. And he calls his brother and said, we can get out if we just throw ourselves with the cask in the water. And his brother doesn't want to know anything about it. He just binds himself on the cask, and he cuts himself loose from the boat, and he just jumps straight into the boisterous waters. And then the wind goes down, but he first sees his brother just disappear into the depth. And he dies, of course. There's no escape. But he just keeps up, and after a moment, when the wind is down, he can escape, and he survives. Now, there are two different names. This story has been used in sociological circles. And sociologists call this two attitudes. One is involvement, and the other is attachment, or detachment. Involvement and detachment. So detachment is the man who just survives. He looks at the world in detachment, and that is a very important thing to keep in mind, this contradiction in the dynamics of worldviews. So a worldview is more than just a scientific exercise. It is actually a collection of thoughts that are in contact and coherent with the power structure of the prevailing society. So if your thinking is inside that worldview, you're not in trouble. You may be in trouble, but not because of worldview problems. Now, while you do all kinds of, experience, people experience all kinds of things, and their ideas automatically develop. So that at a certain moment, their ideas are no longer they're no longer supported by the worldview, and there is a conflict. And that conflict is a conflict with the powers of the society. So it can be very severe, and the whole story of worldview is one of bloodshed and nasty things. So it's much more bad. But then they develop a new worldview, and together a new kind of order, societal order emerges as well. And these two things go together, and then you have a new worldview and a new society, new kind of regime, and that goes on several times. So that's the story of these worldviews, and you can see that very well from the best-known example, the transition from the geocentric to the heliocentric worldview. And geocentrism was, in a way, very comfortable, because it put people in the middle of everything. It was very nice to have the sun turning around you. The sun was just there to give us light and to give us warmth. Sheep existed only because they could give us meat and wool and all the rest of it, milk. And that was all of reality. It was just anthropocentric. This was pure teleology. And there was no scientific thinking in those days. But when Copernicus and all these other people, Galileo and so on, came along, there was a kind of clash, because they told the people that there was that part of reality was not in agreement with this worldview that was totally indifferent. The sun just turned around, or the earth turned around the sun, and the sun was just indifferent to what happened on earth. And that was blasphemy, you can imagine, because it just it was in flagrant conflict with the feudal system that was prevailing. So many of these people were, had a very difficult time. I needn't remember you, Bruno, Giordano was burned on the stake, and all that kind of thing, so it wasn't a pleasure. But then, of course, humans were marginalized in that view, and that was the important thing, and it was the beginning of science. But in the course of time, humans were further and further marginalized. I just remember geology. Hutton was the first person to look into the depth of geological time, and that is an important thing. But also Darwin said that humans are only an animal species. And then we had the next stage, Freud saying that our deepest feelings are just not intellectual at all. They're just coming from some kind of bubbling inside. And so we became more and more marginalized, and I think the end point was reached once by Nietzsche, who said that all truth was to swindle. He was a nihilist. And that is the end of it, it seems, but there was one little spot where our anthropocentrism remained, and that was the Earth. We considered the Earth, as our grandparents did, when I was young as well, I was taught this, consider the Earth as the globe on my grandfather's desk, with all these little lands on it and countries, and the whole world was subdivided. It was a place to be plundered, you could really say. And we could do with it what we wanted and make it a nice place for us. And that was a remaining part of it. And then in 1968, you got the big switch over. We saw, of course, the Earth from space for the first time. And that was a real changeover, as you may remember. We saw suddenly the splendor of the Earth, which was so different from these globes. So that, I think, was the starting point of now this new world view that Lynn is representing. And it gave us hope and anxiety, both, or shall we say, involvement and detachment. The detachment was that we thought, when we can see this, there's no problem left on Earth that we can't solve anymore. And that was the first thought. But after a while, we discovered that this Earth was a horrible place with many disasters on it, and that we're not at all and that was climate change and exhaustion of mineral resources, and globalization was going on, and all of this was really very, very disturbing. So you have now a kind of global change programs that are put up by the governments to find out what's going to happen in a century's time. And if anything it does, it increases the anxiety and the fear and the involvement of the public. So what we need is really a kind of inner light, you know, to think of what is now the great thing to do. And that, I think, is not to look at a century scale, but to take, on the background of it, you see this emerging field, Earth system science, which tells you this wonderful story of the planet of 45 million centuries. And we now get this fantastic story, which is, I think, a big, gives us a lot of inspiration. Now, geology has also changed very much. When I was a student of geology, we didn't even know about the Earth. That was in the time before, in the modernist time. And you see that we had a field that was split up into many disciplines, and we did little bits of pieces of mapping and so on. But then, you know, after the photograph, we saw suddenly the whole perspective of geology changing. And there was first the plate tectonics, there was physical theory, then there was a chemical theory of people like Gerrels and so on, seeing the Earth as a kind of circulating, self-organizing system. And then there was geobiology, and now we're up to geoanthropology. So you see, all these different fields now come together in one big story. The story is that the Earth started off as a kind of glowing ball with not much differentiation. And if you look at it through time, you see it differentiating ever and ever further. It's amazing to see that, first of all, you get, of course, a physical distribution of the core and the mantle and the crust and the atmosphere and so on. The second, then you see the setting of certain tectonic regimes. All that is physical, and then you get the biology, and that's you know, speeds up this process of differentiation immensely, because now you have information coming into play, and it goes all much faster. So you see this huge ramification of all these species coming out of one little cell. And it goes on, and all these different niches arise. Minerals, we just learned, there was first, in the beginning, there were 12 minerals. Now there are 4,500, I believe. And there's only the top of the iceberg. So it's the differentiation is immense. Of course, there were crises. But after a crisis, the whole system, you would think it would just collapse completely, and we have to wait for another billion years to get together again. But the system seems to have a kind of memory, because it veers back and goes in a different direction again. So we have this odyssey, which is totally unpredictable, but only for the differentiation there. Now, it includes also civilization, because suddenly the limits or of Darwinian evolution, which is pretty slow, were superseded, because evolution went outside our bodies. And what we look around here is all civilization. Civilization is the word for the sociologists about everything human. So the whole human history, with all its horrible and beautiful things, it's all civilization. And it's a technical term. But the civilization process is part of Earth history. So all it does is the Earth becoming more and more differentiated. So, not I am doing civilization or part of civilization, but it's the Earth that civilizes. And I am Earth in the deepest recesses of my mind. And this is the consequence of it. So from the point of view of Earth system science, when you look at all the news and what people talk about, we are locked up in our twittering global village and lost contact with the giant creative forces of the Earth. We are like fish in a goldfish in a bowl, imagining that we are masters of the world ocean. And just look with these eyes into the newspapers, and you'll see it all over the place. This is how people think all the time. So that is the last remaining anthropocentrism. So what is the symbiotic worldview say? What is the stone of contention which brings us in flagrant conflict with the dominant power structure? I can't say exactly, but if you ask me to speculate, I would say that no nation, or even the United Nations, will be in charge. All that is the little bubble or the fishbowl. The Earth itself will be in charge, while we will have to adapt like surfers on the ocean waves. I think this is the meaning of symbiosis. So eventually, if you think of it, ownership, which is the holy grail of our society, will be dismissed as plunder. So are we then left in a total state of total humiliation, or is there any chance for us to have any dignity remaining? I think there is. And think, for instance, that when the astronauts saw the Earth for the first time from deep space, with the lunar surface in front, it was the Earth seeing itself for the first time in 45 million centuries through us. Or that science is the way for the Earth to discover itself through us. And that the civilization process, we are, in a way, doing it, but it's the Earth, really, doing the real job. So I think, I would say, let's trust the Earth and not too much ourselves. Thank you very much.